This story is a short based in the world for the novel I am writing. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. The air in the Salt Lake disco was a pressurized lung of sweat, synthetic musk, and the sharp, ozone sting of the strobe lights. Deb was a single filament in a high-voltage circuit, her body caught in the staccato, 120-beat-per-minute grind of the floor. The bass wasn't just music, it was a rhythmic percussion in her marrow, a physical weight that made the wood paneling of the club vibrate with a low-frequency hum. She felt the friction of damp polyester and hot skin, men's hands ghosting over her hips, her own body leaning into the collision of random shoulder blades and the high-velocity heat of the crowd. Every time the strobe hit, the room pixelated into a geometric maze of limbs and dilated pupils. The drugs were a hot signal in her system, a localized power surge. She was shunting just enough to stay upright. She wasn't looking for a face, she was looking for the amperage. She wanted the noise to be loud enough to kill the unfit hum of the Wyoming silence she knew was waiting for her at the state line. The drive from Salt Lake City back to Rock Springs was a 4-hour descent into a high-altitude vacuum. The rusted Nova climbed out of the Wasatch Basin, the engine's rhythmic churn echoing against the steep vertical walls of Parley's Canyon until the urban sprawl of Utah snapped shut behind her. Once she hit the high desert plains, the landscape detranslated. It became a monotonous, high-velocity expanse of gray sage and red silt, pinned down by a sky the color of a bruised lung. The I-80 asphalt was a black, salt-encrusted conductor stretching toward a horizon that never felt any closer. As she hit the Three Sisters, the storm finally locked in. The three massive, tectonic mounds of dirt sat like frozen sentinels in the whiteout, their peaks obscured by a localized cloud bank that turned the afternoon into a jaundiced, sub-zero twilight. The wind didn't just blow, it pressurized. It hit the side of the Nova with a physical weight, forcing Deb to fight the steering with white-knuckled precision as she navigated the black ice frequency of the road. There were no trees, no buildings, only the orange glow of the snowplow beacons and the occasional silhouette of a jackknifed semi-truck, its trailer twisted like a broken limb in the ditch. The air inside the cab was a cold storage unit, smelling of stale menthol and the chemical residue of the city, while the heater rattled with a dry, industrial cough. By the time she descended the final grade into the Rock Springs Basin, the town looked like a low-frequency circuit board flickering in the dark. The jaundiced sodium lights of the Plaza Mall were the only beacons, burning through a thick, stagnant sulfur haze. She pulled into the red silt dirt of Shaw Court, the tires crunching over the frozen ruts. The air here was a different animal. It tasted of diesel exhaust and the raw, anaerobic rot of the Bitter Creek. Mitch was standing on the trailer steps, a flat iron silhouette against the jaundiced glow of the mall security lights. He smelled of chlorine and the high-velocity filth of the treatment plant. "Gates open, Deb," he grunted, his voice a flat drone that matched the vibration of the coal train idling 500 feet away on the west center tracks. "EPA's 1,000 miles away. We shunted the whole load into the creek while you were gone. Just letting the current take the weight." The transition was a terminal failure. The heat of the disco, the friction of the bodies, and the strobe light geometry were archived, replaced by the crushing 4-pound silence of the Wyoming winter. The stagnant, smoke-filled heat of Porky's hit Deb like a physical blow. She moved past the front counter, where the drive-up window was a constant cycle of jaundiced headlights and the mechanical clack of six-packs hitting the service shelf. The back room was a tight, L-shaped bunker of dark wood and localized static. The rhythmic clack of the pool balls and the thud of darts hitting the cork were the only sounds in a space where the silent drinkers were redlining on isolation. Deb sat at one of the two cramped tables, her skin still humming with the residual frequency of the Salt Lake disco. Closing her eyes, she could almost feel the strobe light geometry and the high-velocity friction of bodies rubbing against hers, a sharp contrast to the cold, industrial weight of the Wyoming winter. Mitch didn't sit with her. He was at the short end of the L, leaning into the shadows with the mayor. They were hunched over the scarred wood, their voices a low-frequency rumble lost in the hum of the beer cooler. Deb watched Mitch's face, a flat-iron mask of boomtown pragmatism. The mayor didn't look like a politician, he looked like a weary specialist auditing a failing grid. His hand moved under the ledge of the bar, and a heavy, clinical envelope met the wood with a dull thud. Mitch palmed the cash with the mechanical stillness of a man who had long ago traded his soul for the high-velocity payout. "The shunt's solid," Mitch muttered, his voice reaching Deb as a dry, tectonic rasp. The current is moving. The town's biology is grounded in the creek. Deb felt the unfit hum in her marrow spike. She reached for her red label, the high-purity burn of the liquor a desperate attempt to bridge the gap back to the heat of the disco. But the city was 1,000 miles away, and the mayor's looser money was the only thing with a pulse in the room. She wasn't having fun. She was watching the operators of the town's decay count their silver in a wood-paneled vacuum. She looked at Mitch and realized he was just another component in the machine that was dumping filth into her backyard. The desire to find a way out, a way to ground this noise once and for all, was turning from a street friction itch into a structural necessity. The stagnant, smoke-filled heat of Porky's hit Deb like a physical blow. She moved past the front counter, where the drive-up window was a constant cycle of jaundiced headlights and the mechanical clack of six-packs hitting the service shelf. The back room was a tight, L-shaped bunker of dark wood and localized static. The rhythmic clack of the pool balls and the thud of darts hitting the cork were the only sounds in a space where the silent drinkers were redlining on isolation. Deb sat at one of the two cramped tables, her skin still humming with the residual frequency of the Salt Lake disco. Closing her eyes, she could almost feel the strobe light geometry and the high-velocity friction of bodies rubbing against hers, a sharp contrast to the cold, industrial weight of the Wyoming winter. Mitch didn't sit with her. He was at the short end of the L, leaning into the shadows with the mayor. They were hunched over the scarred wood, their voices a low-frequency rumble lost in the hum of the beer cooler. Deb watched Mitch's face, a flat-iron mask of boomtown pragmatism. The mayor didn't look like a politician, he looked like a weary specialist auditing a failing grid. His hand moved under the ledge of the bar, and a heavy, clinical envelope met the wood with a dull thud. Mitch palmed the cash with the mechanical stillness of a man who had long ago traded his soul for the high-velocity payout. "The shunt's solid," Mitch muttered, his voice reaching Deb as a dry, tectonic rasp. "The current is moving. The town's biology is grounded in the creek." Deb felt the unfit hum in her marrow spike. She reached for her red label, the high-purity burn of the liquor a desperate attempt to bridge the gap back to the heat of the disco. But the city was 1,000 miles away, and the mayor's looser money was the only thing with a pulse in the room. She wasn't having fun. She was watching the operators of the town's decay count their silver in a wood-paneled vacuum. She looked at Mitch and realized he was just another component in the machine that was dumping filth into her backyard. The desire to find a way out, a way to ground this noise once and for all, was turning from a street friction itch into a structural necessity. She quickly drove home. The unfit hum in Deb's marrow was a pressurized valve as she moved through the trailer. She didn't use the theatrical anger of a city clown. She worked with the mechanical precision of a freight auditor. She gathered Mitch's existence, the bleach-stained work shirts, the oily denim, the spare boots, and shunted them into a heavy, black trash bag. When the truck's high-velocity rumble finally vibrated the dirt road of Shaw Court, she was standing on the aluminum steps, the bag a dead weight in her hand. Mitch stepped out, the smell of the T-bird still clinging to his skin like a secondary winding. "What's the audit for, Deb?" he grunted, his voice a flat drone. "The audit's finished, Mitch. I saw the second-story transit. I saw the girl. She didn't scream. She just released the bag, the plastic hitting the red silt with a dull, industrial thud. Get your hardware and get out of the grid. You're a blown fuse." The argument was short, a localized friction of jagged words and defensive static. Mitch didn't try to beautiful lie his way out of it, he just grabbed the bag and climbed back into the truck. As he spat gravel, backing away from the final slot, a eastbound Union Pacific coal train slammed into the frequency. The 500 feet of iron and steel between the trailer and the world became a deafening, rhythmic percussion, swallowing the sound of his engine. Deb went inside, the pressurized silence of the trailer hitting her like a vacuum. She sat at the laminate table, the radiator hissing like a dying animal. She didn't reach for her Wiccan candles. She reached for the Fate magazine she'd brought back from the city. She thumbed through the pulp pages, past the ads for psychic surgery and sea monkeys, until she found the high-voltage signal, the first edition release of the Simon Necronomicon from Schlangekraft. The price was $40, a massive, institutional debt, for a rail office typist in 1977, nearly a week's worth of looser money. To the rest of the world, it was an expensive curiosity. To Deb, it was a piece of high-purity salvage. She pulled her checkbook from the drawer, her hand steady as she drafted the payment. She wasn't buying a book. She was ordering the grounding rod. The 2-week wait was a localized weather front of static and high-voltage resentment. Outside, late November in Rock Springs turned the world into a monochromatic vacuum. The sky was a bruised sheet of lead, and the wind whipped off the mountain with a sub-zero edge that made the aluminum siding of the trailer shriek. Deb spent her nights redlining on hate. She didn't use the Joy Boy candles. She used the hardware of the desperate. She performed hexes and bindings with the clinical coldness of a forensic auditor, using Mitch's left-behind hair and the gray slime she scooped from the Bitter Creek to build a localized psychic cage for him. She sat by the window, watching the jaundiced security lights of the Plaza Mall, her hand hovering over the rotary phone. She could end his sewage scam with one call to the state capitol, shunting his looser money life into the grid of a legal blowout. Then the notification arrived. She picked up the package from the post office, the cardboard box feeling heavier than the physical weight of paper should allow. Back in the Shaw Court trailer, with the radiator hammering a rhythmic percussion against the Wyoming cold, she broke the seal. The 1977 Schlangekraft Necronomicon wasn't a beautiful lie of a book. It was a piece of uninsulated industrial machinery. It was a massive 4-pound quarto, bound in a black vinyl cover that had the dull, oily sheen of a specialized gasket. The title was stamped in a predatory, metallic gold that seemed to catch the jaundiced light of her kitchen lamp and hold it. When she opened it, the scent hit her, not the smell of old library dust, but a sharp, 0-degree ozone and the chemical tang of fresh, high-velocity ink. The pages were thick, high-purity bond, and the cuneiform wedges of the starry script weren't just printed. They looked like they had been etched into the paper by a high-frequency laser. This was the raw, unrefined engine of the sacred science. Deb didn't read for enlightenment. She performed a terminal audit. She sat at the laminate table for 72 hours, the Union Pacific coal trains vibrating her marrow as she mapped the 7 gates and the names of the 50. She was drawn to the text with a visceral, magnetic pull, her fingers, still stained with the carbon of the rail office, tracing the sigils of the Igigi as if they were freight manifests for the abyss. She realized the manual was a hot conductor. It didn't care about her Wiccan, don't die a second time ethics. It was a Sumerian circuit breaker, designed to ground the unfit hum of the human world into the pressurized silence of the Abzu. By the time she reached the gate of Marduk's section, the air in the trailer felt thick, pressurized, and structurally revised. She wasn't a typist anymore. She was a technician who had finally found the manual for the mountain. Deb didn't sleep. She sat at the laminate table in the pressurized silence of the trailer, the jaundiced light of the overhead lamp reflecting off the black vinyl cover of the Necronomicon. The book was a piece of high-purity hardware, its 4-pound density a localized gravity well in the room. She moved through the pages with the grim, tireless focus of a man performing a forensic audit on a crashed engine. The cuneiform wedges weren't just letters, they were schematics for a vacuum. She mapped the load-bearing names of the 50, her fingers, still stained with the carbon smudge of the freight office, tracing the sigils as if they were freight manifests for the abyss. Every sentence felt like threading a rusted, cross-threaded bolt. It was a manual for grounding the unfit hum of her life into the 0-degree current of the Abzu. By the third night, the radiator's rhythmic hammer seemed to sync with the starry script on the page. She wasn't looking for peace. She was looking for the terminal. The next evening, the sub-zero Wyoming wind whipped the red silt against the aluminum siding as she loaded the hardware into the Nova. She had the black vinyl manual, a fresh bottle of Red Label, and a heavy iron screwdriver she'd taken from Mitch's toolbox. She drove toward the Blairtown Park turnoff, the tires of the Nova spitting grit as she bypassed the flickering neon of the Plaza Mall. The site was a hot pocket of pressurized silence, tucked into the jagged shale of the mountain grade. Deb pulled the rusted Nova into the gravel lot at Gibson's Discount Center, the windowless retail fortress looming like an industrial terminal at 1154 Dewar. She moved with a mechanical stillness toward the jewelry counter, her eyes measuring the stock with the grim focus of a technician. She selected the hardware she needed, 2 heavy silver bracelets and a thick chunk of copper pipe that had been repurposed into a decorative paperweight. To the clerk, they were just ornaments, but to Deb, they were conductors for the natural energy described in the manual. She paid for the metal with the carbon-stained cash from her freight office paycheck, the clinical thud of the jewelry hitting the counter echoing in her marrow. She moved to the back of the store, toward the electronics department. This was the high-security grid of 77 retail. The 8 track tapes were locked behind massive plexiglass displays and wrapped in thick, anti-theft plastic to prevent unauthorized transit. She found the one she wanted. Donna Summer's I Remember Yesterday. The cover was a jaundiced neon dream, a hot signal of the Salt Lake disco frequency she was desperate to hold onto. The security setup was a structural challenge. There was a circular hole in the plexiglass, just large enough for a potential buyer to reach in and feel the weight of the inventory. Deb reached in, her fingers ghosting over the plastic-wrapped cartridges. As she tried to pull the Donna Summer tape toward the opening, the plastic snagged. She gave it a sharp, rhythmic tug, and the uninsulated end of the tape unspooled with a dry, plastic shriek. A localized mechanical failure left a foot of the magnetic ribbon dangling out of the cartridge like a disemboweled gut. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice a flat iron rasp. The clerk approached with a weary, industrial sigh. He unlocked the plexiglass display to retrieve the damaged unit. "Damn things," he muttered, looking at the shunted tape. "I'll have to mark it down." "I'll take it anyway," Deb stated. She didn't want a perfect copy, she wanted the one that had already suffered a blowout. She paid for the bracelets, the copper, and the broken 8-track, the heavy bag a hot weight against her ribs. She walked out of Gibson's into the sub-zero wind. She had the silver for the circles, the copper for the grounding rod, and the disco frequency for the weight. She was heading back to the Shaw Court trailer to prep the hardware for the second gate. Deb walked out of the trailer and into the pressurized cold, the Union Pacific tracks an iron spine vibrating with the frequency of an approaching eastbound freight. She didn't have a furnace, but she had the industrial weight of the rail. She knelt in the red silt and laid the silver bracelets and the copper pipe onto the cold, polished surface of the track. The world shattered as the coal train hammered past. The sound wasn't a roar, it was a rhythmic, high-velocity percussion that made her teeth ache and the dirt beneath her boots structurally shudder. When the last car groaned away, the silence rushed back in like a vacuum. The hardware had been structurally revised. The copper and silver were no longer ornaments. They were paper-thin conductive sheets, flattened by the raw tonnage of the coal cars. It took her 20 minutes to audit the gravel to find the pieces. One of the silver strips had taken a 300-foot trip down the line, a bright, metallic glitch in the gray rock. Back in the trailer, she folded the metals with the mechanical focus of a specialist. She layered the silver into a rough, 4-inch square and the copper into a jagged, knife-edged sliver. She tried to manual restart the metallurgy using the kitchen stove, laying the silver in a cast-iron skillet and hitting it with a hammer until the rhythmic clank filled the small room. She flipped it, hammered again, but the heat of the propane burner wasn't enough to fuse the molecular grit. The silver stayed stubborn, a clumsy stack of foil that wouldn't hold a charge. She needed more amperage. The next evening, her friend Brenda crunched into the dirt lot of Shaw Court. Brenda didn't ask questions. She just brought her husband's industrial propane torch and a piece of steel scrap she'd salvaged from the rail yard. They worked on the trailer's aluminum steps. Deb placed the silver into a shallow indentation she'd hammered into the steel scrap, a crude, unauthorized mold. She pulled the trigger on the torch, and the blue, high-velocity flame hissed against the metal. Because the silver was so thin, it hit its melting point in seconds, turning into a pool of liquid light that filled the mold. When it cooled, it wasn't a bracelet anymore. It was a single, high-purity silver square, a terminal component for the second gate. Brenda watched the violet-tinted smoke rise from the cooling metal, her eyes narrowing in the jaundiced glow of the mall security lights. "That's some heavy-duty jewelry, Deb," Brenda muttered, her voice a flat drone. "It's not jewelry, Brenda," Deb rasped, her fingers tracing the smooth, industrial surface of the silver. "It's a component." The copper didn't respond like the silver. When they hit it with the propane torch, the jagged sliver just oxidized, turning a bruised, industrial purple without ever reaching a flow state. It was a clumsy rejection of the heat. Brenda gave up and headed back to her own trailer, but Deb couldn't let the frequency drop. She needed a knife, a grounding rod, and her current hardware wasn't up to the spec. The next morning, she drove to the library, the Nova's heater coughing out a dry, dust-caked warmth. She spent 2 hours redlining on frustration in the occult section until she felt a localized tug at her sleeve. A 5-year-old boy, looking like a pale shadow in the oversized adult stacks, was holding out a heavy, cloth-bound volume on traditional blacksmithing and metallurgy. He didn't speak, he just pointed at a diagram of a charcoal forge before drifting back into the silence of the shelves. At the checkout counter, the librarian's voice was a weary, low-frequency rasp. "That's Ken. His mother brings him here every Tuesday. She signed a permission slip for anything in the building, claims it's the only way to keep him quiet. Poor kid's got marks on his arms that don't come from falling off a bike. He reads like he's trying to find a way out of his own skin." Deb took the book back to the Plaza Mall. Inside Ernst Home Center, the air was a pressurized mix of sawdust and fertilizer. She didn't look at the consumer theater, she moved straight to the tool aisle and bought a 3-pound sledgehammer, the weight of the steel head a solid, clinical promise in her hand. On the drive back to Shaw Court, she detoured along the service road hugging the Union Pacific Main Line. She scanned the red silt and gray ballast until she found it, a discarded railroad tie plate. It was a 12-pound slab of high-carbon steel, pitted with rust but structurally sound, the perfect anvil for an unauthorized forge. Back in the trailer, she laid the tie plate on the kitchen floor, the iron meeting the linoleum with a heavy, tectonic thud. She had the book, she had the sledge, and she had the anvil. She was done with the clumsy propane torch. She was going to use the sacred science of the hammer to force the copper into the shape of a blade. The kitchen of the single wide became a high-pressure forge. Deb stood over the gas range, her pliers gripping the flattened copper as she held it into the hissing blue flame. The iron railroad plate sat on the linoleum like a tectonic anchor. She worked with a mechanical, obsessive stillness. She heated the metal until it glowed a bruised, industrial cherry red, then slammed it onto the iron plate. The rhythmic clank-clank-clank of the 3-pound sledge was a localized percussion that fought the heavy vibration of a coal train dragging past the Shaw Court lot. Each strike was a structural revision of the metal. Heat, strike, flip. The copper resisted, but the sacred science of the hammer forced it into a jagged, rough blade. Once the shape was locked, the blade was a scorched, oxidized black, a record of the molecular friction. Deb took a honing stone and began the slow, rhythmic audit of the surface. The sound was a dry, metallic shriek. She moved to sandpaper, stripping away the soot until the high-purity copper finish emerged, shimmering like a neon flare in the jaundiced kitchen light. She didn't use an engraver. She used the iron screwdriver to etch the Sumerian sigils from the 1977 manual into the blade. Then, she pulled a serrated steak knife from her kitchen drawer. Her breath hitched as she used the clumsy kitchen steel to carve the load-bearing names of the watchers into the silver square. The metal shrieked against metal, a raw, uninsulated frequency that made her marrow ache. The hardware was finally in spec. The copper grounding rod and the silver conductor were synced to the manual. She was ready for the second gate. Deb shifted the Nova into low gear, the engine's laboring whine matching the atmospheric pressure as she climbed away from the industrial noise of the town. She tracked the old county road, bypassing the Walnut Street turnoff just as Belt Loop Drive crested the hill. The jaundiced glow of the Plaza Mall was a distant, flickering circuit board below, silenced by the sub-zero Wyoming wind. She found the highest point the Nova could reach, a jagged plateau of shale and red grit that felt like the structural apex of the county. She stepped out, the air so thin it tasted of cold iron and vacuum. The world up here was a pressurized silence, a 0-degree laboratory where the town's street friction couldn't reach. She knelt in the thin sand, the wind whipping the grit into localized vortices. She didn't use her hands. She reached for the copper grounding rod. The blade, polished to a high-purity shimmer, felt hot against her palm, vibrating in time with the marrow-deep hum of the mountain. With the mechanical precision of a technician, she used the knife point to trace the second gate into the sand. Each stroke was a physical audit of the 1977 manual's geometry. She didn't just draw, she carved into the crust of the earth, the copper tip shrieking against the buried shale. The markings weren't decorative, they were a terminal schematic designed to catch a specific frequency. When the last wedge was set, the air around the circle didn't just chill, it detranslated. The red sand within the boundary turned a bruised, ultraviolet black, and the unfit hum of her life began to flatten into a terrifying, high-velocity alignment. The sub-zero wind on the crest of the mountain was a physical weight, pulling at Deb's nylon jacket as she knelt in the red, high-alkaline sand. She didn't look at the distant flickering of rock springs. She focused on the silver seal of Nana she'd forged in the trailer. It was a 4-inch industrial square, etched with the jagged cuneiform wedges of the moon god, and it felt like a cold iron anchor in her palm. Deb knelt in the high alkaline sand, the cold biting through her denim. Before she touched the copper rod, she had to clear the street friction from the site. She didn't use incense, she used the exorcism of the barren ground from the book Maklu. She paced the perimeter, her voice a dry, industrial grating as she shunted the local unfit hum out of the workspace. Next came the purification invocation. She stood at the center, facing the distant, jaundiced glow of the Plaza Mall, and called the 8 directional guardians. This was the shielding, creating a localized vacuum where the mountain's silence could be harnessed. Then, the circle. Using the copper grounding rod, she traced a 12-pointed mandala into the grit. This wasn't a beautiful lie of a drawing, it was a jurisdictional boundary. She placed the silver seal of Nana at the center point. The air began to thicken, tasting of wet iron and ozone. Deb stepped out of the Nova, the door groaning on its hinges with a dry, metallic shriek that was immediately swallowed by the pressurized silence of the mountain crest. The air was a razor of absolute zero, tasting of frozen stone and the chemical residue of the Dewar corridor she'd left behind. She didn't hesitate. She reached into her windbreaker and pulled out the hardware, the copper blade she had hammered into spec on the railroad tie plate. It wasn't a decorative athame, it was the blade of Inanna, a jagged, high-purity grounding rod that felt hot with a subterranean violet pulse. She moved to the center of the plateau, her boots crunching the red silt into the shale. Following the book of entrance, she began the exorcism of the barren ground. She didn't chant, she spoke with the mechanical stillness of a technician clearing a terminal. I suppress thee. I thrust thee away. In the name of the Watcher, depart from this place. She paced the perimeter, the copper blade leveled at the horizon. With each step, the street friction of the town, the scent of Mitch's betrayal and the anaerobic rot of the creek, was shunted out of the workspace. Then came the 12-pointed circle. Deb knelt and pressed the point of the copper blade into the high alkaline sand. She traced the mandala with a slow, rhythmic pull, the metal shrieking against the buried rock. At each of the 12 nodes, she paused to anchor the frequency. When the circuit was closed, she placed the silver seal of Nana at the dead center. The forged metal immediately caught the jaundiced light of the distant mall and transformed it into a low-frequency, internal glow. She stood at the center of her jurisdictional boundary and began the preliminary purification. Numa tu uranu thumathir. Numa tes ges thumathate. The Sumerian hit the air like a high-voltage discharge. The air within the 12 points didn't just chill, it structurally revised. The red sand turned a bruised, ultraviolet black, and the atmosphere became a suffocating, kiln-dry pressure. She raised the copper blade toward the north, her marrow humming in sync with the high-frequency vibration of the manual's commands. Deb stood at the dead center of the 12-pointed maze, the silver seal of Nana at her feet pulsing with a predatory, ultraviolet light. The blade of Inanna in her hand had reached a terminal temperature, the copper glowing a bruised cherry red that scorched her palm. She began the final incantation of the walking. Her voice was a dry, industrial rasp, cutting through the high-frequency hum of the Watcher at the perimeter. Gate of Nana, open. By the covenant, I command thee. Numa tu uranu thumathir. The air didn't just vibrate, it collapsed. The sand within the circle detranslated, turning into a flat, obsidian slab that radiated a 0-degree cold. Then, the square of silver at her feet hit its peak frequency. It expanded, the metal bleeding outward until it formed a glowing, geometric threshold on the high alkaline dirt, a glowing square of pure, uninsulated violet light. To the Sumerians, this was a literal threshold, a vertical breach into the moon's jurisdiction. To Deb, standing in the sub-zero Wyoming wind, it just looked like a hot, visual glitch on the ground. She saw the glow and felt the unfit hum of the mountain flatten into a stable equilibrium. I did it, she thought, her pulse hitting a flat iron anchor of relief. The circuit is closed. She didn't wait to see if the air would tear further. She didn't look for the obsidian geometry beyond the light. To her, the glow was the proof of the sacred science, the signature of a successful audit. She began the license to depart, her fingers white-knuckled around the cooling copper blade. Depart, watcher of the gate. Return to thy station. The covenant is kept. The many-eyed shadow at the edge of the circle twitched, its high-velocity silhouette dissolving back into the gray sagebrush and the street friction of the night. Deb then moved to the edge of the mandala and used the point of the knife to physically break the 12-pointed line, shunting the remaining natural energy back into the red silt. The violet square flickered once and snapped shut, leaving the mountain crest in total, jaundiced darkness. The structural revision was over. Deb stood in the silence, her lungs burning with a cold iron taste of the air. She tucked the blade and the silver seal back into her windbreaker, feeling like a technician who had successfully tested a new engine without redlining it. She didn't realize that the gate hadn't just been a light show, it was a doorway, and by closing it before stepping through, she had left her biological signature on file with the Watchers. She walked back to the Nova, the sub-zero wind at her back. She was heading back to Shaw Court, unaware that the gate wasn't behind her. It was already starting to rewrite the geometry of her own trailer. The unfit hum of the mountain didn't stay on the ridge. It followed the Nova back down to the west center ruts. It started in the REM cycle, a structural breach of her sleep that felt more like a surveillance feed than a dream. In the dream, Deb stood on the Union Pacific ballast under a sky the color of a wet slate. A woman in a black, Victorian-style dress was pacing the iron spine of the tracks. Her face was a gray-scale void, but her movement was a rhythmic, mechanical twitch. Dragging behind her in the red silt were the slug beasts, pale, low-slung violations of biology that left a trail of iridescent, high-velocity slime on the coal dust. They didn't have eyes. They had hollow, vibrating vents that pulsed with a 0-degree cold. The next morning at the Red Horse Oil Station, the world detranslated into a charnel house. The air inside the service trailer didn't smell like 10W30 anymore. It smelled of anaerobic rot and stagnant copper. Every time a driller or a truck driver leaned into the plexiglass window to pay, the street friction of their presence was overwritten by the stench of death. It was on their breath, a localized cloud of decomposing pulp and frozen iron that made Deb's stomach convulse. She shunted the cash through the drawer with white-knuckled precision, her marrow humming as she realized the safe science of the first gate had left her biological sensors permanently red-lined. When the shift ended, she drove back to Shaw Court, the sun a jaundiced, failing spark over the mountain. She pulled the Nova into the lot, the tires spitting gravel, and stopped dead. There, less than 500 feet away on the railroad tracks, stood the ghost. It was the same black dress, the fabric looking like a light drinking shroud against the gray ballast. The woman stood perfectly still, her presence a vertical glitch in the industrial landscape. But the slug beasts were gone. There was no iridescent slime, no rhythmic pulsing of vents. Just the woman, a silent gray-scale auditor standing in the exact coordinates of the dream, watching the trailer with a clinical, unblinking intensity. Deb sat in the car, her fingers gripping the steering wheel. The Bitter Creek was a toxic gray trickle behind her, and the Union Pacific was a vibrating iron heart, but all she could hear was the pressurized silence of the woman on the tracks. The gate hadn't stayed on the mountain. It had moved into her backyard, and it had brought the Abzu census with it. The night following the ritual, the unfit hum of the mountain didn't just stay in the air, it achieved a physical, gray-scale mass. Deb was at the grocery store, the fluorescent lights of the aisles flickering with a jaundiced, high-frequency stutter. As she reached for a gallon of milk, she saw it. A walking dead of the Abzu, a Giddim, drifted through the automatic doors. It wasn't a beautiful lie of a movie ghost, it was a biological violation of gray dust and stagnant air. It wore the tattered remains of a work coat, its face a hollowed-out void that smelled of bitumen and cold iron. The entity didn't attack. It didn't even acknowledge the consumer theater around it. It simply paced past her in the parking lot, its movements a rhythmic, mechanical twitch. As it moved, it shed a fine, alkaline powder that looked like coal ash. Deb knelt in the red silt, her fingers trembling as she touched the trail. The dust was real. It was cold to the touch, a physical residue of the house of dust left on the Wyoming asphalt. When she got home to the Shaw Court trailer, the pressurized silence was gone. It was replaced by the scratching. It started in the aluminum walls, a dry, obsessive percussion that sounded like obsidian claws dragging against the insulation. It moved with a mechanical stillness, traveling from the kitchen to the bedroom, always just behind the faux wood paneling. It wasn't mice. It was a forensic audit of her residence by the watchers she had summoned. She sat on the edge of the bed, the Necronomicon a dead weight on her lap. The scratching didn't stop. It was the sound of the gate trying to redline through her reality, a structural revision of her home that she couldn't shut out. She realized then that by using the blade of Inanna to bridge the gap, she hadn't just opened a door, she had invited the Abzu to reclaim its jurisdiction. The scratching in the walls spiked into a frenetic, dry percussion, the sound of 1,000 obsidian needles seeking a fracture in the trailer's aluminum skin. Deb bolted upright as the Wyoming wind slammed into the single wide, a predatory howl that didn't just rattle the windows, it carried the discordant frequency of human voices shunted through a high-velocity vacuum. She crawled to the window and pulled back the thin, salt-crusted curtain. Her marrow turned to ice. The dirt lot of Shaw Court was gone, replaced by a grayscale census of the Abzu. Hundreds of them, the Giddim, stood in the red silt, their bodies built of clotted dust and stagnant shadows. They weren't moving, they were just staring, their hollowed-out sockets fixed on the trailer with a clinical, unblinking intensity. The jaundiced light from the Plaza Mall security towers caught the gray clumps of their dust wings, making the scene look like a detranslated photograph of a massacre. Deb was a structural wreck. Her nervous system was redlining on terror. She didn't think, she performed a terminal evacuation. She snatched the Necronomicon, the copper blade, and the silver seal, shunting the uninsulated hardware into a heavy black trash bag. She grabbed a rusted shovel from the porch and threw herself into the Nova. She spat gravel, the headlights cutting through the grayscale crowd that didn't even flinch as she roared past. She hammered the accelerator, her mind fixed on the flaming gorge. She wanted the book grounded under 100 feet of cold, alkaline water. But as the Nova crested the hill past Blairtown, the fuel gauge hit the red. The engine sputtered, a mechanical cough that signaled a terminal stall. She couldn't make the gorge. She veered off the main belt, cutting through the jagged, industrial ruts of the road toward Quealy. She pushed the Nova up a steep, secondary turnoff, the tires screaming against the shale until she reached the top of a massive sandstone shelf. The wind-up here was an absolute zero razor. To the east, the underground coal fires of Quealy sent thin, toxic plumes of white smoke into the moonlight, the breath of the mountain itself. Deb stepped out of the car, the trash bag a leaden anchor in her hand. She wasn't looking for a beautiful spot, she was looking for a grave. The sandstone shelf at Quealy was no longer a high desert overlook, it was a terminal floor. Deb stood paralyzed, the rusted shovel slipping from her fingers with a hollow metallic clang against the rock. The toxic plumes from the underground coal fires thickened, turning the moonlight into a jaundiced, ultraviolet haze. From the jagged shadows of the sagebrush, the census of the Abzu arrived. They didn't march, they drifted, a sea of hundreds of grayscale dead, the Giddim, their bodies built of clotted dust and stagnant iron. They formed a silent high-pressure ring around the Nova, their hollowed-out sockets fixed on Deb with a clinical, unblinking intensity. The air became a localized vacuum, a zero-degree weight that made every breath taste of dry silt and ozone. Then, the crowd of dust ghosts buckled. A team of the Igigi shunted through the grayscale mass. They were biological violations, their disjointed, light-drinking bodies moving with a staccato, mechanical rhythm that defied the geometry of the shelf. Their crab-like claws, translucent and hard as obsidian, clicked against the sandstone in a dry, rhythmic percussion. Deb didn't even have time to scream. The unfit hum in her bones reached a terminal frequency as the Igigi closed the distance. They didn't just attack, they audited. The disjointed limbs and many-eyed shadows converged on her in a high-velocity blur, devouring her biological signature in a frantic, wet chorus of guttural static. She was shunted out of the human grid, her marrow and memory archived back into the Abzu. The black trash bag containing the manual, the silver, and the copper blade didn't stay on the surface. As the Igigi pulled her under, the red sand beneath the bag liquefied into a toxic, shifting vortex. The weight of the sandstone boulder at the edge of the shelf seemed to tilt, its tectonic mass shifting just enough to swallow the hardware. The sand rushed back in, a dry, industrial seal. Minutes later, the only thing left was the Nova, its engine ticking as it cooled in the sub-zero wind. The grayscale dead were gone. The Igigi were gone. The Necronomicon was buried deep beneath the sandstone, a grounded, 4-pound engine waiting for the next operator to trip the circuit. The Wyoming highway patrolman stepped out of his cruiser, the blue and red strobes pixelating the sub-zero twilight into a jaundiced, staccato geometry. He crunched over the shale of the Quealy turn-off, his breath a localized cloud of frozen vapor. The 72 Nova sat on the high sandstone shelf, a dead component in the high desert vacuum. The driver's side door stood open, groaning on its hinges with a dry, metallic shriek as the wind hit the frame. Inside, the dome light flickered with a weak, failing frequency, illuminating an empty seat and a cold dashboard. The trooper moved his flashlight across the ground. There were no signs of a struggle, no biological debris, no clumsy evidence of a flight. The red silt had already begun to drift, a fine, industrial powder that was systematically archiving the footprints until the sandstone was a smooth, undisturbed plain. He walked to the edge of the large boulder, the beam of his light catching a single, jagged scratch in the rock that looked like it had been made by a translucent, obsidian claw. But the light didn't penetrate the shadows beneath the stone. The silver seal and the copper blade were grounded, buried in a high alkaline tomb alongside a 4-pound vinyl engine that had finished its audit. The trooper radioed back to dispatch, his voice a flat, industrial drone against the atmospheric roar of the wind. Vehicles abandoned at the Quealy shelf. No sign of the Vance girl. It's a 0 point out here, send the tow. He didn't see the thin plume of white smoke rising from the coal fire vent 20 feet away, or the way the air seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that made his teeth ache. He just shunted the door shut, leaving Debra Vance's life to be devoured by the pressurized silence of the Wyoming winter.